somewhere in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, farther from any other inhabited place than anywhere else on Earth, a few hundred people live on the side of an active volcano. There is no airport. There is no way to fly in, no matter how much money you have. The only way to reach them is a 6-day boat journey across some of the roughest open ocean on the planet, and even that boat might not sail for weeks, depending on the weather. This is Tristan da Cunha, and once you understand just how alone it really is, you'll never think about isolation the same way again. Picture an island so remote that the nearest land with people on it is over 2,000 kilometers away, and even that place is itself one of the most isolated islands in the world. Picture a population of only a few hundred people, most of them sharing just a handful of surnames, descendants of a tiny group of shipwrecked sailors and settlers who chose to stay centuries ago. And picture an entire community that, within living memory, had to evacuate their homes in the middle of the night as their own island erupted beneath them. How do people not only survive in a place this cut off from the rest of humanity, but actually choose to keep living there generation after generation? Let's find out. To understand just how isolated Tristan da Cunha actually is, you have to abandon almost every reference point you'd normally use for a remote island. This isn't a place a short flight away from a mainland, or a quiet corner of an otherwise busy archipelago. Tristan da Cunha sits alone in the South Atlantic Ocean, roughly 2,800 kilometers from Cape Town, South Africa, which makes it the closest continent, and even that distance is close to 1,800 miles of open sea. Travel in the other direction, toward South America, and the nearest coastline is more than 3,000 kilometers away. The nearest inhabited land of any kind, the island of St. Helena, sits roughly 2,400 kilometers to the north, and St. Helena itself is already considered one of the most remote islands in the world. In other words, the closest neighbors Tristan da Cunha has are themselves impressively isolated, and there is still an enormous stretch of open ocean between them. The island itself is almost perfectly circular, a volcanic cone roughly 11 kilometers across, rising dramatically out of water that reaches thousands of meters deep just offshore. At its center stands Queen Mary's Peak, a volcano that climbs to just over 2,000 meters and is still very much active. Its summit frequently wrapped in cloud, snow occasionally dusting the top, even though the island sits in temperate, windswept latitudes. The entire archipelago, which includes a scattering of smaller, completely uninhabited islands nearby, sits directly on the mid-Atlantic ridge, the underwater mountain range, where the tectonic plates beneath the Atlantic Ocean are slowly pulling apart, a geological fault line running straight beneath one of the loneliest patches of inhabited land on the planet. That volcanic foundation isn't just a geological curiosity, it has directly shaped the island's history, and it very nearly ended it. In 1961, after weeks of tremors and warning signs, the volcano at the heart of Tristan da Cunha erupted, forcing the entire population, every single resident of the island, to evacuate in the middle of the night, first to a nearby beach, and eventually all the way to England, thousands of kilometers away, a place almost none of them had ever seen. Lava flowed directly toward the settlement, destroying the island's only crayfish canning factory and coming close enough to threaten homes that had stood for generations. Though, remarkably, no lives were lost in the eruption itself. For nearly 2 years, an entire island community lived as refugees in a country most of them had only heard about secondhand, housed together in a disused Royal Air Force base in England, adjusting to a completely different climate, culture, and pace of life, encountering escalators, cinemas, and city traffic for the first time in their lives, while newspapers and film crews treated them as a genuine curiosity. Islanders from the edge of the world suddenly transplanted into the middle of post-war Britain. And then, remarkably, when scientists determined the island was safe again, the overwhelming majority of Tristan's residents chose to go back. Given the opportunity to resettle permanently in Britain, with all its comforts and connections to the rest of the world, most of the community decided that a small, volcanic, nearly inaccessible island in the middle of the South Atlantic was still, unmistakably, home. That choice says something essential about who ends up living on Tristan da Cunha, and why. The island's modern population traces back to a tiny handful of settlers. The first European to sight the island was a Portuguese explorer in the early 1500s, who gave the island his own name but couldn't land because the seas were too violent. It wasn't until the early 1800s that permanent settlement actually began, when the British stationed a small garrison there, driven largely by strategic fear that the French might use the island as a base to help free Napoleon Bonaparte, who was being held in exile on St. Helena, far to the north. When the garrison eventually withdrew, a handful of soldiers and settlers chose to stay behind rather than leave. And over the following decades, a small trickle of shipwrecked sailors, whalers, and a few adventurous settlers from places as far away as Italy and the United States gradually joined them, building a permanent, if tiny, community from scratch. That founding population was so small that its effects are still visible today. Even now, the entire island's population, which sits at only a couple of hundred people, is made up almost entirely of descendants from just a handful of founding families, meaning that only a small number of surnames exist on the island at all. Walk through the settlement and you'll find that a significant share of the community shares one of just a handful of last names, a level of genealogical closeness that would be almost unthinkable anywhere else, but that on Tristan da Cunha is simply an accepted, everyday fact of life. It's a closeness the island manages carefully rather than ignores. Over the generations, islanders have generally understood the importance of marrying outward when possible, whether to visiting sailors, scientists stationed on the island, or partners met during rare trips abroad, a quiet but essential strategy for keeping such a small population healthy and viable across successive generations. Daily life here revolves entirely around a single settlement, officially named Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, though islanders themselves simply call it the settlement. It is the only town on the entire island, home to essentially the whole population, a scattering of modest houses climbing gently up from the coast toward the base of the volcano that looms over everything. There is one shop, there's one pub, there's a school, a small hospital, a church, and a single road connecting the settlement to the island's agricultural plots. A few kilometers away, known locally as the Patches, where islanders still grow much of their own food. That short stretch of road is famously served by what's often described as the most remote scheduled bus route anywhere in the world, a tiny, almost quaint detail that captures just how small-scale life on Tristan really is, and how seriously the community still takes the basic rhythms of getting to work, tending crops, and coming home again. Land ownership itself works differently here than almost anywhere else on Earth. Rather than being bought, sold, or inherited as private property the way it typically is elsewhere, land on Tristan da Cunha is held communally, shared among the community as a whole rather than divided into individually owned parcels. Families are allocated plots to farm, particularly potatoes, which remain a dietary staple grown in those outlying patches, but the underlying land itself belongs to everyone collectively. It's a system that has helped keep the tiny community remarkably equal, in a place where the alternative, a handful of families accumulating land and wealth on an island this small, could easily have fractured the community entirely. Food on Tristan da Cunha still reflects the same self-reliance that has defined the island since its earliest settlers arrived. Beyond the potatoes grown at the Patches, most households keep small numbers of cattle and sheep, grazing on the island's windswept lower slopes, while fishing supplies not just income but a steady supply of protein for the table. Because a supply ship might not arrive for weeks at a time, families have always planned meals and stores around what's already on hand rather than what might be shipped in, freezing and preserving what they catch or grow rather than depending on a delivery schedule they can't control. Even something as ordinary as a birthday cake can mean carefully rationing whatever flour and sugar happen to be left in the shop's stockroom until the next boat finally appears on the horizon. Economically, Tristan da Cunha survives on a combination that would be almost impossible to replicate anywhere less isolated. The single largest source of income is the local rock lobster fishery, a species of crayfish found in the cold, nutrient-rich waters surrounding the island, caught by islanders and exported remarkably to restaurants and seafood markets in the United States, Japan, and parts of Europe. Given how disconnected the island is from global shipping routes, it's a strange thought that a lobster pulled from the water just off Tristan's rocky coast might end up on a plate on the other side of the world within a matter of weeks. Alongside fishing, the island earns income from the sale of postage stamps and commemorative coins to international collectors, a tradition that traces back generations and remains a surprisingly significant source of revenue for a territory this small. Tristan da Cunha stamps are prized specifically because of the island's obscurity, a postmark from one of the least visited places on the planet, and collectors around the world pay a premium for exactly that scarcity. Tourism brings in a further smaller trickle of income, though it remains tightly limited by the same logistics that constrain everything else here. A handful of expedition cruise ships occasionally include Tristan da Cunha on itineraries built around the wider South Atlantic, and independent travelers determined enough to arrange passage on a fishing or supply vessel do occasionally make the journey. But there is no infrastructure here built to handle mass tourism, no hotels beyond a couple of small guest houses, no restaurants beyond what the settlement's tiny community already supports for itself. Visitors who do make it are typically hosted, quite literally, by island families, folded briefly into a community that has always had to make room for outsiders carefully rather than constantly. The waters surrounding Tristan da Cunha also make the island scientifically significant in ways most visitors never fully appreciate. Because the surrounding ocean sees so little industrial fishing or shipping traffic, it has become an important refuge for seabirds, including species found almost nowhere else on Earth, along with fur seals and other marine life that thrive precisely because human activity here has stayed so minimal. Researchers occasionally travel to Tristan and its uninhabited neighboring islands specifically to study ecosystems that have remained largely undisturbed, a rare scientific benefit of the same isolation that makes ordinary daily life here so difficult. But the defining fact of daily life on Tristan da Cunha isn't the lobster fishery or the postage stamps. It's the sheer difficulty of simply getting there or leaving at all. There is no airport, And geographically, there likely never will be, since the island's steep volcanic terrain leaves essentially nowhere flat enough to build a conventional runway. The only way in or out is by sea, typically aboard a fishing vessel or supply ship making the journey from Cape Town, a crossing that takes the better part of a week under normal conditions and can be delayed for extended periods by the same rough Atlantic weather that has isolated the island for centuries. There's no regular passenger ferry schedule the way you might expect at a more accessible island. Visits are planned months in advance, built around the movements of fishing and supply vessels rather than a fixed timetable, which means that a medical emergency requiring evacuation, or simply a family wanting to visit relatives abroad, can mean waiting anxiously for a ship that might not appear for weeks. That isolation shapes healthcare in ways that would be unthinkable almost anywhere else in the developed world. The island maintains a small hospital and a resident doctor, capable of handling routine medical needs and minor emergencies, but anything beyond that, a serious injury, a complex surgery, a critical illness, typically requires evacuation off the island entirely, a process that depends entirely on which ships happen to be nearby and how quickly they can reach Cape Town or another equipped port. In a genuine emergency, help can be days away rather than minutes, a reality every islander lives with quietly in the back of their mind. And yet, despite all of that, the community on Tristan da Cunha has built something that feels less like survival and more like a deliberately chosen way of life. Because the population is so small, nearly everyone works multiple roles simply to keep the settlement functioning. Fishermen who also serve on the island council, teachers who also help run the small radio station, farmers who double as volunteer firefighters or nurses' aides when needed. The chief islander, an elected position representing the community's interests, works alongside a British-appointed administrator who typically resides on the island for a limited term, blending local self-governance with the broader oversight of the wider British overseas territory that also includes St. Helena and Ascension Island, both administered from far closer to the African coast. The Island Council meets regularly in the settlement to decide on everything from fishing quotas to infrastructure spending, community decisions made by people who will personally live with the consequences, since there is no distant capital to shift responsibility to and no way to simply move away if a decision turns out badly. Communication with the outside world, once nearly non-existent, has slowly improved, though it remains far from seamless. Satellite internet has arrived in recent years, letting islanders video call relatives who have moved abroad and allowing children to access educational resources that would otherwise be entirely out of reach. A genuine transformation for a community that, within living memory, depended on infrequent letters carried by whichever ship happened to be passing. Even so, connectivity remains limited and can be unreliable, another reminder that modern technology, however far it has reached, still runs up against the sheer physical remoteness of a settlement this far from anywhere else. Socially, the smallness of the community creates a closeness that's difficult to overstate. With a population this tiny, everyone genuinely does know everyone else, not in the loose, exaggerated way that phrase gets used about small towns elsewhere, but literally, completely, down to every extended family relationship on the island. Major life events, births, weddings, funerals, become genuinely communal occasions, involving a significant share of the entire population rather than just an immediate circle of friends. Religious life, centered around the island's small church, remains a central pillar of weekly routine, one of the steady, unchanging threads running through a community whose physical surroundings, an active volcano, an unpredictable ocean, a shifting handful of visiting ships, offer very little else that stays reliably the same. The natural environment surrounding Tristan da Cunha is as extreme as its isolation suggests. Powerful winds sweep almost constantly across the island, a product of its position deep in the roaring 40s, the band of latitude notorious among sailors for its relentless westerly gales. Rainfall is frequent, the climate cool and often overcast rather than tropical, closer in feel to a wind-swept corner of the British Isles than to anything resembling a South Atlantic paradise. The surrounding waters, rich with marine life precisely because they're so undisturbed by industrial fishing fleets, support important seabird colonies and rare species found almost nowhere else. And a fact recognized by conservationists who consider the wider Tristan archipelago, including its uninhabited neighboring islands, among the most ecologically significant stretches of ocean anywhere on Earth. Living this far from the rest of the world inevitably means living with real, unresolved vulnerabilities. The volcano at the center of the island remains active, monitored but never fully predictable, a permanent reminder of the eruption that once forced an entire community into exile. Population numbers have stayed remarkably small and largely static for generations, constrained by the same isolation that defines everything else about life there, with young islanders sometimes leaving for education or opportunities that simply don't exist locally. Echoing a pattern found in remote communities around the world, just intensified here by distances most people will never fully grasp. Some who leave for school or training abroad do eventually return, drawn back by family and familiarity, but others settle permanently in South Africa or the United Kingdom, slowly reshaping a population that can't easily be replenished from anywhere else. Supply shortages, delayed medical evacuations, and the sheer unpredictability of ocean crossings remain permanent features of daily planning rather than rare disruptions. And climate change adds a newer, less certain risk on top of all of it, with scientists watching how shifting storm patterns and a warming ocean might affect a community that has almost no capacity to simply relocate. And still, generation after generation, the descendants of those original shipwrecked sailors and stationed soldiers have chosen to stay, to rebuild after volcanic eruptions, to keep farming the same communal plots their ancestors first cleared, to keep fishing the same cold Atlantic waters, to keep gathering in the same small church on the same rocky coastline at what might be the loneliest inhabited address on the entire planet. For them, the extreme remoteness that makes Tristan da Cunha a curiosity to the rest of the world isn't a hardship they're simply enduring. It's the exact thing that has kept their tiny, tightly knit community intact, protected from the pace and pressure that has reshaped nearly everywhere else. In a world where almost no place remains truly cut off anymore, Tristan da Cunha still is, and its people have decided, again and again across generations, that this is precisely the point. If a place this isolated, this resilient, and this quietly extraordinary caught your attention, subscribe, because there are more stories like this waiting. Communities holding on at the very edges of the map, in places most of the world has genuinely forgotten exist.